She collected her daughter from the daycare center at 3 o'clock after she finished having a late lunch with Mackie. No! Over a gently steaming plate of still warm chicken gyoza and hearty, nourishing rice, she and Mackie had discussed Mr. Terada's comments about their tanka poems. Though she was still a relative novice, Mr. Terada had been very complimentary about her poem. Apparently her use of repetition had captured the peaks of the snowy, desolate mountains perfectly. She had blushed with pride as Mr. Terada had complimented her, her head bent. Shyly, she had tried to claim that her poem was not that good, not really. It didn't seem fair to some of the other women who had been studying under Mr. Terada for years. If she'd captured the silence and sadness of the mountains, it was because of her own lived experiences. The words had welled up not from vague ideas or reminiscences of blurred photographs, but from her own past. How could she be complimented so highly, by Mr. Terada no less, for indulging so in her own memories? But Mackie had laughed when she protested and told her to be less humble. You should learn how to accept a compliment. They won't kill you, Mackie had chortled while biting into the crisp outer shell of her gyoza. I suppose I still need to work on that, she had replied, her head bowed in suitable humility. Mackie laughed. You've been attending classes here for almost half a year now. You don't need to be so polite. That's just how I was raised. You country girls are all so funny. Funny? How? You get so flustered whenever somebody says something nice to you. You're not allergic to compliments, are you? I'm just unused to it. People didn't used to be so nice to me. Well, get used to it. I think you have real talent, and you're fun too. Hey! Mackie waved over a passing waiter without any restraint. Can we have some more green tea? She'd been mortified by Mackie's openness and had slunk down in her chair, her face bright red. City-born women were so different to those from the countryside, she had reflected, while the water topped up Mackie's cup. Mackie had no problems accepting compliments from Mr. Terada. While some of the other students at Mr. Terada's poetry lessons would try to deflect his praise, Mackie never bothered. She simply smiled. Some of the women, the ones who hadn't been born in Tokyo, thought Mackie was too shameless. They whispered about her behind her back. Initially, she had agreed, but after 3 weeks, she changed her mind. Mackie was incredible. She was everything she had always wanted to be and everything she could never be. She wondered as she poked her own gyoza with her chopsticks, whether she could have been so spirited if only she'd been raised in a different environment. Maybe it was the tall buildings of Tokyo that did it. They were so aggrandizing. One born here amidst the hustle and bustle of cars and shops and sprawling residential areas had to be sure of their own sense of self, or they would get swept away. Mackie wore Western fashion. She turned her nose up at traditional Japanese clothes and instead wore the most amazing outfits. Flared trousers. Also, I realized I haven't had the music on. Oops. Flared trousers, button-down shirts, print dresses with hems that stopped at the knee. It was Mackie who, after their first session with Mr. Terada, had taken her shopping. She owed her current outfit to maroon sweater and pleated skirt to the older woman's tutelage. It had been a bit disconcerting at first to wear something so very short, but it was liberating too. For this was how Western women dressed. She never imagined. The process of reinvention was hard, and sometimes it was scary, but it was never without merit. Finally, from the clothes and manners and gestures that had been imposed upon her for years by her mother, she could be the woman that she always wanted to be. Bold, fierce, determinedly independent. The dinner with Mackie concluded, she hoisted her bag about her shoulder and set off to the nursery. It was only a few streets away from the restaurant, so she walked. It was in the middle of November, and it was starting to get cold. Though no snow had fallen, the air was chilly. It tugged at her hair, making it flutter behind her like a wave. It was nostalgic. It reminded her of home. Maybe that was why she'd written about Maybe that was why she'd written the poem about the mountains. Ever since her move to Tokyo, she'd paid little attention to her memories. But now the weather had changed. They were coming back to her like snowflakes dancing in the airs. In the air, not airs. And to think, only 6 months ago, she had been living in the desolate mountains of Hakuba. How things have changed. Her daughter, Yukiko, was delighted to see her mother. Though they'd only been parted for a few hours, to her it must have seemed like years. Yukiko threw her arms around her mother's neck and clung to her close like a monkey. She laughed and turned and scooped Yukiko up in her arms. Yukiko was young, only 3 years old, and she could be cradled as easily as a bag of flour. She had to stop by the supermarket on the way home to buy some pork for dinner. Pork was her husband's favorite, and he'd been so very busy with work ever since their move to the big city. Okay, thank God. The child is not... What's his face? Iji's. It's not Iji's child. Thank God I wasn't right about the frickin' pregnancy possibility. Thank God. But first, she had somewhere she wanted to go. Okazaki's was a small, relatively dusty bookshop that had been built many years ago. The shelves were wooden and reached all the way to the ceiling, and they were crammed with old tomes. The inside of the shop was lit by gas lamps, but they were always dim, perhaps to preserve the books. Some of the books in the old place, decrepit as though it was, were rather valuable. At least that's what the owner said. She wasn't too sure if she believed her. The owner was a peculiar woman. She had cleaned through repeated visits. The owner had inherited the shop from her grandfather, and she had done little to fix it up. It smelt peculiar inside the shop, of dust and ink and bancha tea. Bancha tea was known for its strong straw-like smell, which made the young woman think of farms. It was the owner's favorite drink, and she always had a mug of pale green bancha tea with her. Yukiko didn't like the smell of the tea, and she would always complain when her mother took her to this small, out-of-the-way library. Apparently it hurt her eyes. Her mother had ceased bringing Yukiko with her for a while to lessen her complaints. But today was a special occasion. After months of searching on her behest, the owner finally managed to get her hands on a book she had been seeking for the last 5 years. The book itself was nothing special. It was a slim volume of poetry by an author who had, 20 years or so ago, been quite popular for his breakout piece, Fireworks. Now, Tanabe Iji was just an old name, just as dusty as the books that lined the shelves of Okazaki's. It was still possible to find his anthology of earlier pieces, including the famed Fireworks, and she'd uncovered a second-hand, dog-eared volume of his first and only novel in a second-hand bookshop. But this collection of poetry was different. Unfortunately, the poetry anthology hadn't been as moving as she had remembered it in her childhood, and the novel was almost excruciatingly maudlin. The novel featured a young girl, apprenticed to be a geisha. The girl's mentality had belonged more to an older man than a teenager. At least she didn't remember being moved to examine her own breasts in such detail when she was 15. A little disappointed by her finds, she had vowed to move on from Tanabe Iji and his works. He was a misty figure who inhibited her past. Sleeping ghosts were best left alone. Still, despite her resolution, her curiosity continued to haunt her. There was one collection of poems of his she had not read. Few people had. It had been released in a very limited print run. Only 1,000 or so copies had been created. Trying to find one had been nigh impossible, and after scouring all the used bookshops and libraries she had almost given up on her search. That was until she had heard about Okazaki's. Apparently, if given time, the owner could find any book one could ever want, even lurid tales of so-called romance that were deemed to be indecent. She wasn't interested in such stories, however. She was more interested in the poems. 6 Days of Snow. Now the owner had finally managed to find it, and she could read it at long last. The work, which had been written and addressed to her. "Take good care of it," said the owner, Shoko, as she had handed her the book. "Finding this took me no small amount of trouble." "I'm aware," she replied with a small bow of her head. "Thank you very much. I don't do this for free, you know. I might be kind, but my heart isn't that deep." "I know, I appreciate it. Here." She drew a few bills from her pocket and slid them over the wooden counter, which was marked with rings from the bottom of Shoko's ever-present cup of bancha tea. Shoko, as she had discovered, wasn't the sort of woman who bothered with silly things like coasters. The bookshop was so dingy and run down there was little point. That's the rest of the paymass. We agreed." "Thank you," said Shoko, with a small bow of her head and a cat-like smile. "It's a pleasure doing business with you." She took the book in her hands, holding it reverently, and walked to the back of the shop. There were a few chairs set for prospective buyers to flip through their future purchases, but few people used them. Maybe it was because of the smell. It was so dingy in the back of the shop it was hard to see, but at least the smell of the bancha tea was less pervasive here. She took a seat on the chair, the book in hand, and pulled Yukiko on her lap. Yukiko squirmed for a few moments, evidently displeased by this arrangement, though she had clung to her mother desperately just a few moments hence. "Mommy," said Yukiko, pouting, "I'm bored. Can we go home now?" "Just a second. I want to look at this first." "Can you look at it at home?" "I could," she said with a small pause as realization finally hit her. She could take this book home if she so desired. She had paid for it, and it belonged to her now. It was yet another volume she could add to her slim collection on Tanabe Iji. But reading Iji's works at home, where she cooked meals for her family and played with Yukiko and slept with her husband, didn't seem entirely right. This was an experience that was best had in a place like Okazaki's, in the dark and in the gloom. It was a place where she could indulge in her memories, free from prying eyes, and then seal them away once more like the sparkling city of Atlantis. "This book is important to me," she said by way of explanation. "Would you mind waiting?" Yukiko lifted her head, her interest piqued. "Does it have pictures?" "I don't think so." "Then I don't care!" "Wouldn't you like to at least see it?" "Well, just a peek." "'Kay." "Then let's take a look." Her heart pounding inside her mouth. That's weird. She slowly cracked open the pages of the book. Iji's last volume of poems. A love letter. To her. There, inside the front cover, she could see an inscription, meaningless to those who hadn't been there at the Izami Inn all those years ago and didn't know what happened, but priceless to her. To Reiko. I hope you find your own happiness someday. That's the same thing that's at the beginning of the freaking game. Every time you turn this game on, that little phrase there appears. Reiko sniffed. She felt something catch in her throat, and she didn't think it was the dust. She looked down at Yukiko, cradled in her arms. Her weight was warm and comforting against Reiko's lap. She thought about her new life in Tokyo, the poetry lessons and the art class, and classes in her feeble attempts to learn French, the meals out with Maki, and the large shrines far, far fancier than anything Hakuba had to offer, and her childlike amazement upon her very first trip to the cinema. She thought about her new friends and her husband and their plans to travel the world, China, France, Italy. She thought about all the places she had seen already and all the places she wanted to see. She thought about the people by her side and the people she had left behind. She thought about everything that had led to this moment, sitting in the back of Okazaki's, surrounded by bookshelves, her fingers poised over Tanabe Iji's 6 Days of Snow. She thought long and hard, and then... "Hey, Mummy," Yukiko piped up suddenly. "Are you going to turn the page?" "Oh," said Reiko, starting in surprise. "I'm sorry." "Were you thinking about something?" "I was thinking about a lot of things." "Happy things?" "Some of them." Yukiko screwed up her face. "I don't like sad things." "Neither do I." And that was why Reiko had vowed she would leave the sad, lonely little girl from her past behind her. She was a new woman now, her own person. Maybe in the end she didn't need to read a second-hand account about herself from a man she had barely known and hadn't loved, but thought she might have cared for about her own loneliness. She had moved on from then. The words on the page would never change, but she had. She had changed more than she thought was possible. Why was she trying to find her old, lost self amongst these static pages? Time could be rewound as many times as you wanted within a series of poems. You just needed to keep flipping back to the beginning. But real life didn't work that way. Her life didn't work that way, and she was thankful for it. She didn't need to dig up her old memories now like the snow that had fallen around the hot springs. And so with this thought in mind, "Mummy!" Reiko closed the book. She set it to one side. She had paid a hefty sum of money for it, but now she had no longer wanted it. She no longer needed it. "Are you going to leave this book behind?" asked Yukiko. "That's right," Reiko replied. "But why?" "Because," said Reiko, pressing a kiss against Yukiko's cheek. "I already have what I want right here." If Iji had written those poems, hoping Reiko could become happy, if Iji had written these poems, hoping Reiko could become happy one day, he needn't have worried. Reiko's life might not have been a fairy tale, but that didn't mean she would be unhappy forever. All snow melted if you gave it enough time. Well, okay, at least we got somewhat of a happy frickin' ending. Alright, the epilogue wasn't bad. Still grossed out. I'm still grossed out. But at least Reiko isn't stuck at the inn suffering with her mother for all eternity. We know things got better. And that's all that matters. My throat is broken. If you can tell, maybe, I don't know. I'm gonna die if I speak any more words. So I'm gonna go. So, bye. Bye. And now we can play the freaking clip where I win. Yeah.
It looks like we have a winner.
Okay, bye now.